A photograph should hold stillness, yet this one refuses to stay put. The plate shows a small boy, seated and unsmiling, but his eyes are doubled. Two pupils float in each iris like coins laid on black water. The second pair glints where no light should reach. The effect is not blur nor motion, nor any error common to the wet plate process. It looks like a face that tried to be in two places at once and almost succeeded, according to reports. The image was developed in 1882 on a collodion tintype at a private asylum somewhere in southern England. Documents confirm that only a single 15-second exposure was taken. Official records state there is no matching patient name, no corresponding file number, and no entry in the ward census for that week. No witness alive has confirmed the negative's chain of custody. The plate exists. Its owner does not appear in any book. Here is the promise, stark and simple. We will trace 3 anomalies bound to this image. First, the overnight switch that turned a farm child into a case study on a single June date. Second, the ward-wide contagion that made other children speak in borrowed tongues. Third, the 15 seconds when a camera saw something its sentry did not have words to name. Before that, a disclaimer sits like a thumbprint on glass. The dates conflict. The asylum's ledger lists a sealed ward in late summer, but the photographer's exposure log cites mid. The place shifts as well. One annotation names St. Wilfrid's Children's Hospital outside Brighton. Another, in a different hand, says Titchfield. Some pages smell of smoke, others of mildew and glue. The archive burned twice, and the surviving fragments disagree with one another like relatives at a funeral. It was said the boy never officially existed. If that is true, then the plate should not exist either. Yet here he is, with duplicated pupils and a fixed mouth, preserved in silver that outlasted everyone who signed for it. The question presses closer with each breath you take beside the image. If the child was never admitted, never named, never tallied, then whom did the lens arrest? Documents confirm a single approving stamp on the back paper, faded to the color of tea. It bears no signature, only a rushed initial that could be a C or an E or nothing at all. According to notes reportedly copied in 1911, the plate entered a private collection under the heading, Unidentified Patient. Anomaly 14. The negative changed hands discreetly over the following century, crossing borders and attics with the quiet persistence of a rumor that refuses to lay down. The boy's eyes deny you. Look long enough, and the extra pupils stop reading as error. They vault from flaw to feature, then from feature to threat. You cannot unsee them once the mind accepts their claim. A camera is supposed to instruct the eye in cautious realism. Here, the instrument misbehaves. It offers a witness that no one is willing to name. A physician's note, allegedly tucked beside the plate, reads as a warning. No corroborating birth record. Avoid firm statements. The line begins. It continues. The ward was under observation. The chaplain present. The doctor reluctant. The handwriting tilts, as if written quickly, or as if the hand shook. Official records state that the asylum operated a children's experiment ward between 1879 and 1884, and that its logs are incomplete due to fire. Fire erases. Fire also rearranges. What remains can mislead by what it leaves behind. So we return to the image, the only object with enough weight to anchor the story. 2 pupils in each eye. A face that greets you twice and never blinks. A mouth that seems to know your name though it refuses to speak. It is not a magician's double exposure, we are told. It is not a retouched print. Modern examiners report no knife marks under magnification and no second plate beneath the first. If the scene world can split, here is where it chose to do so. This will not be a tale of gore or indulgence. It will concern dates, margins, and the dull music of institutional tone. It will hold to what can be weighed, and it will admit every crack. The record ends where speculation begins. The photograph lives where both insist they are right. If the boy never officially existed, the question sharpens to a single point. Who sat for 15 seconds in a chair, no ledger admits, and why do his eyes not match the rules of his time? The England of 1882 believed it was climbing toward light. Factories roared, trains carved through farmland, and every county built its own asylum. Progress was measured in iron and steam, and the number of minds confined behind brick. After the industrial boom, the kingdom turned inward. The wars were distant, but their ghosts lingered in the new science of the soul. Madness was no longer a curse to pray against. It was a mechanism to study, dissect, and, if possible, restrain. The asylum replaced the dungeon, but the walls remained high. Across the southern counties, labor shortages filled the wards with orphans and transients. Irish navvies, Polish refugees, and London's unwanted children drifted into these places, tagged with paper bans and moral Doctors called them defective, clergy called them possessed. The difference was often timing. Records from the period confirmed that St. Wilfrid's Hospital stood on the edge of Brighton's industrial sprawl, a red brick labyrinth of dormitories and chapel wings. Official accounts describe it as a facility for moral instruction and restorative confinement. Yet most files stop abruptly after 1884. Fire destroyed the medical annex. taking with it the admission books for the children's ward. The building itself was demolished before the First World War, leaving only a chapel foundation and a few warped rails of a garden fence. According to reports, the controversial photographs surfaced within the same year those records vanished. Scholars later linked it to the St. Wilfrid's Children's Ward, where new humane therapies were being tested on subjects who rarely lived long enough to be discharged. At the center of this experiment was Dr. Elias Crowhurst. His credentials were impeccable, trained in Edinburgh, lectures on child hysteria, papers published in the Journal of Moral Psychology. Yet his methods blurred the line between science and penance. He believed illness was the body's confession. He believed pain revealed truth. Witnesses claimed Crowhurst's ward resembled a monastery more than a hospital. Children rose at dawn, recited verses, fasted twice a week, and endured hours of what he called discipline by repetition. When questioned, he spoke of reforming the animal within. His notes, half medical and half sermon, show a man certain that he could cure sin through structure. Victorian England admired such certainty. The culture feared degeneration madness as an infection that could corrode the nation's bloodline. Newspapers warned of moral contagion spreading through poor districts. The church whispered that the devil had found a language in children's sleep. Science promised it could prove otherwise. Crowhurst courted both audiences. He published sermons disguised as case studies. He debated priests in drawing rooms, declaring that demons were only misfiring neurons. But privately, his correspondence reveals something darker: a fascination with what he called mirrors in the mind, the idea that one patient's madness could reflect into another. Documents confirmed that his funding came from a joint medical church commission. Both wanted answers. The church sought signs of the divine in disorder. The scientists wanted data. Neither got what they expected. By 1882, St. Wilfrid's had become a quiet experiment in controlling the unpredictable. Its walls held the confidence of empire, the belief that all mysteries could be named, measured, and put to use. But when the unnamed boy arrived that June, the machinery of understanding ceased. It was as if something old had entered a new century and refused to translate. June 17, 1882. The date appears in 3 surviving ledgers, each slightly different in tone, but consistent in the single word beside it. Admitted, the entry refers to an unnamed male, estimated age 9. The diagnosis line reads unprovoked trances and glossolalia. The handwriting is Crowhurst's, tight, deliberate, written with the same pen he used for surgical notes. No birthplace is listed. No guardian's signature follows. The child entered the institution without a past. According to the matron's private diary, the boy arrived near midnight during a thunderstorm. A local constable had found him standing in a ruined field house struck by lightning earlier that evening. The constable reported that the child was unharmed, though the bodies of 2 adults were discovered nearby. Their identities remain uncertain. No parish record matches their description. It was said the boy would not speak English, only mutter phrases the officers could not understand. The constable assumed Polish or Latin, though neither fit the syntax. When questioned by attendants, the child stared past them and whispered what witnesses described as forecasts. He spoke of rising winds, failing crops, a church bell breaking on Sunday. None of the staff could explain how he knew of a storm moving inland from the channel. The telegraph had not yet carried word of it. Crowhurst's own notes from that night record a mixture of fascination and unease. He describes the boy as alert in trance, unresponsive in waking. He notes pulse irregularities, body temperature lower than expected, and brief moments of lucidity during which the child drew circles in the air and counted backward in Latin. Crowhurst writes, his gaze gives the impression of seeing through the eye. Not with it. Parish records searched later that year list no baptism under the child's supposed name. In fact, no name is consistent across the documents. Some call him Specimen A, others, the June patient. The ledger that survived the fire omits the entry entirely, leaving only a half-burnt page number between 17 and 18. It is possible that someone removed it before the blaze. It is also possible it was never entered at all. Witnesses claimed the child exhibited calm detachment, as though unaware of where he was. Nurses noted that he appeared unbothered by confinement, rarely ate, and often stood at the window murmuring. According to one report, he asked when the House of Mirrors would open again. Though no such structure existed near St. Wilfrid's. By dawn, Crowhurst ordered a full examination. Instruments were prepared, measurements recorded. The doctor's margin note reads, a subject of remarkable composure may provide insight into linguistic instinct. That phrase would later be cited by investigators as evidence of intent to experiment. No official admission photograph was taken, yet less than a month later, a tintype showing a boy of similar features surfaced in the asylum's archive. If that image truly belongs to the same child, then the camera captured him before anyone knew his name, or perhaps before he had one. Whatever entered St. Wilfrid's that night did not fit within the century's language of medicine. It arrived like weather, spoke like scripture, and refused to explain itself. Within a week of admission, the boy began to draw. He was given paper only to keep him quiet. but his sketches unsettled the staff. They were not childish scenes or idle patterns. They were anatomical diagrams, arteries, ocular nerves, and the inner coil of the human ear rendered in clean lines. Documents confirm that Crowhurst kept the sketches. Several match unpublished surgical notes from his own lectures. Notes never circulated outside the hospital. According to one witness, the doctor turned pale when he saw the resemblance. He asked the boy who had shown him these things. The child answered softly, "I remembered it from before." Nurses later claimed he had no access to books or charts. No one could have taught him anatomy in his first 10 days at the ward. He had spoken little English when admitted, yet now used precise terms from Latin texts the staff themselves barely understood. Crowhurst recorded his speech as grammatically unstable but semantically correct. The strangeness deepened. The boy began to anticipate events. A week after his arrival, a lamp shattered in the dormitory corridor. An hour before, he had murmured, "Glass falls at midnight." 2 days later, he predicted the death of a nurse's mother in Bristol. A woman who records confirm died the same evening of fever. One attendant wrote that he wept for someone not yet dead. Crowhurst struck the line through in the report, but it remains legible under LAMPLIGHT. At first, the asylum treated his statements as coincidence, the byproduct of hysteria or fever. Yet patterns hardened. He described the orderlies' private quarrels before they occurred. He recited sections of their prayers backwards, verbatim. Witnesses said his tone carried no pride, only weary repetition. By the second week, Crowhurst arranged nightly observation sessions. 2 nurses recorded data at 15-minute intervals. The logs disagree. One claims the trances lasted 3 nights. Another insists on 7. Even the clock times differ. The doctor's own handwriting blurs in places, as though his notes were written during tremors. According to later transcripts, the boy's speech during these trances resembled fragmented sermons, references to doors, mirrors, and the circle of light within light. When roused, he denied speaking at all. Asked to translate his phrases, he appeared confused and frightened. The ward began to change around him. Patients who shared his dormitory reported vivid dreams and bouts of nausea. One child woke screaming that his eyes would not close all the way. Another began tracing the same diagrams on his bedsheet in the dark. Crowhurst ordered isolation. The boy was moved to a locked room near the disused chapel. Official records confirm the relocation on July 3, 1882. The document lists precautionary seclusion. No reason follows. Crowhurst's later journal reveals a tone of awe rather than skepticism. He writes, "Subject demonstrates knowledge beyond capacity or instruction. Possible manifestation of stored ancestral memory may suggest mind as continuum, not singular." Modern researchers interpret this as an early attempt to describe collective unconscious decades before the term existed. But even he could not sustain detachment. The next entry shifts to fear. Observation required, he notes, but do not meet his eyes in reflection. The phrase repeats across multiple pages, underlined twice. By mid-July, the doctor's confidence faltered. He no longer invited colleagues to witness sessions. The official reports became sparse, replaced by brief, coded remarks. He referred to the child not by name but by an initial, sometimes A, sometimes O. One margin note reads, "Language self-generating, speaker redundant." This was not the first time Victorian medicine mistook mystery for revelation. Society adored the spectacle of the prodigy, the idiot savant, the somnambulist prophet. Newspapers printed their stories beside tales of seances and telegraphs. The border between divine and delusional grew thin. But what happened at St. Wilfrid's did not fit any of these fashions. The boy did not perform. He only endured. His silence became the loudest thing in the ward. Nurses avoided his room. Crowhurst began sleeping in his office, leaving the lamp burning all night. According to later accounts, he complained of hearing Latin whispered from the vents. The words matched phrases from his own discarded manuscripts. It was then that the boy's presence shifted from marvel to threat. The doctor's final note from this phase states, "Pattern spreading beyond subject. Containment advised." The handwriting wavers, ink pooling at the bottom of each line. After that, the medical entries pause for 4 days. The next surviving page resumes abruptly with physical descriptions, temperature, pulse, and a new anomaly that no textbook could explain. By the 4th week, the body began to contradict the boy's age. Orderlies reported that his skin grew colder each day until their thermometers failed to register any reading at all. Crowhurst's notes confirmed this anomaly, though he offered no explanation. He wrote simply, "Temperature beneath measurable range. No signs of distress." The child's pulse slowed to a rhythm almost too faint to detect. He remained conscious but distant, watching the air as if tracking something invisible. The doctor measured his pupils daily. They no longer responded to light. Instead, the edges shimmered irregularly, widening and contracting without pattern. Nurses described the effect as alive within itself. Within days, hair thickened at unnatural speed. Fingernails darkened, curving like soft horn. The medical staff debated thyroid failure, catatonia, or parasitic infection. Crowhurst initially agreed, then crossed the diagnosis out. His next entry reads, Symptoms mimicked decay in the living. Witnesses claimed the boy's presence unsettled instruments. Clocks in the ward began losing minutes, then hours. Barometers reversed. The isolation rooms mirror-fogged constantly, though the air remained dry. It was said that even candles refused to stay lit near his bed. Crowhurst maintained clinical procedure, at least outwardly. He instructed his assistants to record the boy's vitals every 2 hours. The results became nonsense. One night's log shows alternating fevers and hypothermia within the same hour. Another lists a pulse of 0 yet awake. The nurses were less restrained. 2 resigned within the week. One cited religious reasons, the other unbearable dread. Their replacements lasted days before requesting transfers. The matron herself refused to enter the room after dusk. Her final note to Crowhurst pleads, "Sir, there is something watching through him." The doctor dismissed such fears in writing but not in practice. He began fasting with the patient, claiming solidarity. He forbade any mention of spirits or miracles, though his margins betray creeping doubt. Unclean miracle, he scribbled beside a temperature chart. By July's second week, Crowhurst restricted access to the isolation cell. He alone tended the boy, recording sessions in locked journals. According to later transcripts, he sought to verify whether physiology could anchor phenomena of the soul. In private, he wrote of a hypothesis, the organism as vessel, not host. The asylum's chaplain requested permission to observe. Crowhurst refused. He argued that faith and superstition would only contaminate results. Yet letters recovered from the diocesan archive revealed the chaplain's growing alarm. He described the doctor's demeanor as possessed by certainty, estranged from sleep. Medical curiosity had curdled into obsession. The boy's body defied decay, but his surroundings wilted. Wallpaper peeled, iron rusted overnight, and the tiled floor beneath his cot warped from damp. Nurses whispered that rot followed him like weather. Official records ceased for 3 days around July 20th. When they resumed, the tone changes. The entries are brief, typed rather than handwritten, and signed by an assistant. Crowhurst's own signature is absent. The first of those resumed notes reads, "Observation suspended pending clerical review." The second adds, "Diocese notified, Father Henley dispatched." The conflict between medicine and faith was about to begin. Father Henley arrived on July 24, 1882. He was a practical man, known less for piety than for skepticism. The diocese had sent him to dispel rumor, not perform ritual. He carried a small valise of oils and prayer cards, but insisted they would not be needed. His report, preserved in church archives, begins with a cold remark, "Symptoms of hysteria, not haunting." Crowhurst met him at the gate. Witnesses claimed the doctor had aged 10 years in a month. His hair had gone gray at the temples, his voice hoarse from sleeplessness. The 2 men spoke briefly before entering the isolation cell together. Only the assistant remained outside, instructed to open the door if the lamp dimmed. According to the official record, Henley conducted no formal exorcism. He observed, questioned, and prayed under his breath while the doctor took measurements. The boy lay motionless, eyes open, breathing When the priest asked his name, the child responded with Henley's baptismal date accurate to the day. The priest reportedly froze. Crowhurst dismissed it as coincidence, though his hand trembled while writing. The session ended in dispute. Henley insisted the child required spiritual intervention. Crowhurst declared it a case of somatic mimicry. Their argument carried down the corridor. Nurses overheard the priest accusing the doctor of pride and sacrilege. Crowhurst replied that the church feared knowledge it could not own. The next morning, the boy refused food and speech. Crowhurst ordered controlled fasting to monitor endurance. Henley denounced the act as cruelty. He attempted to contact the diocese for removal of the patient, but the telegraph lines were reported down after a lightning strike. The coincidence did not go unnoticed. Later that week, the isolation chamber was sealed to all but medical staff. Henley was barred from further entry. His subsequent report written from the rectory condemns the doctor's experiments as arrogant trespass upon divine mystery. Yet Crowhurst's surviving journals tell a different story. In the margin of one volume, a second handwriting appears beside Henley's name. He saw, but denied. The script does not match Crowhurst's. Modern analysts suggest it may have been added later, though the ink dates to the same decade. Faith and empiricism, each claiming truth, both faltered in that narrow cell. The priest left the hospital within days, his health failing. Parish documents list his cause of death 6 months later as a wasting illness of unknown origin. The church never reopened inquiry. Crowhurst, now alone, took the silence as license. He suspended routine care for the rest of the ward and focused solely on his patient. Witnesses said he stopped attending chapel entirely. The hospital board reprimanded him in writing. One letter remains, stamped but unsigned. He ignored it by early August. St. Wilfrid's had become 2 institutions, sharing one roof, a hospital upstairs, and below it, a laboratory of faithless devotion. Crowhurst's science no longer sought cure but confirmation. He wanted proof that something beyond language could inhabit flesh. That proof would come soon, but not in the form he expected. Contagion began quietly. A child in the adjacent ward was found at dawn, standing beside his bed, whispering Latin phrases no one had taught him. The same words appeared in Crowhurst's early transcripts of the unnamed boy. The nurses assumed imitation a cruel kind of play, but the tone was wrong. The boy's eyes were shut, his voice steady, unchildlike. Within 3 days, 3 more patients followed. Each entered trances at irregular intervals, sometimes mid-meal, sometimes mid. They spoke the same phrases, identical in rhythm and cadence. According to reports, one girl repeated a passage that Crowhurst had dictated privately during a closed session. He demanded to know who had leaked his notes. None had access. Documents confirmed that the hospital recorded these incidents as psychogenic influence, a term newly coined to explain the mind's capacity to imitate madness. Yet the records end there. No follow-up study, no cure, no recovery, just a list of initials and the instruction: separate dormitories effective immediately. The staff felt the shift before they named it. The corridors grew silent. Laughter vanished. Orderlies refused night duty. The matron noted in her surviving ledger that several workers claimed to hear their names whispered from empty rooms. One nurse resigned after insisting the boy had called her by her dead brother's name. When told the boy could not have known, she fainted. Crowhurst treated these episodes as evidence of transmission. He described the phenomenon as contagion without contact, the spread of cognition through proximity. His colleagues accused him of blasphemy and madness in equal measure. He responded by sealing the isolation wing entirely. No one outside the ward saw the child again. Meals were left outside the door. The trays returned empty but undisturbed, as though the food had evaporated. Crowhurst alone entered, documenting his observations in rapid, fragmented prose, replication uncontrolled. One line reads, "Vocal resonance, extending beyond subject." The hospital board requested a diocesan review. Their letter remains unanswered. By the time an inspector arrived, Crowhurst met him at the gate and declared the ward under quarantine. He produced falsified signatures and a physician's seal. The inspector accepted them, unwilling to step inside. Witnesses claimed the children in the common ward began to hum at night. The sound carried through pipes and walls and unbroken, low frequency like distant machinery. Those who heard it too long reported headaches, then dreams of water, mirrors, and flickering lights. One orderly smashed every reflective surface in his quarters. Before fleeing the grounds, Crowhurst's notes from this period are increasingly erratic. He refers to the event not as illness but as echo. The handwriting deteriorates. Ink stains blot entire lines. He writes of thought contagion, of mirrors sharing one reflection, and finally, observer infected. According to later testimony, he requested permission to install new equipment, galvanic probes and phosphor plates to measure physiological response during trance. The board, unaware of the full situation, granted the request. It was then that the investigation shifted from observation to proof. Crowhurst's isolation ward became an experiment chamber. The boy's stillness turned to signal, his silence to data. The asylum had entered its own contagion of belief. Faith and skepticism had both fled, leaving only the need to record whatever emerged next. And something did emerge. Crowhurst began the experiments. On August 3, 1882, the official report, later recovered from the hospital's burnt archives, calls it physiological verification under controlled conditions. Unofficially, it was an attempt to trap whatever moved behind the boy's eyes. He installed galvanic probes, thin copper wires connected to a crude voltaic battery. They were meant to measure muscular reactions, though no one could agree on what constituted a normal response. Phosphor-treated plates lined the walls to trace faint light emissions. Witnesses described a glow that came and went like breath on glass. Records confirm this was among the earliest documented uses of electrical stimulation on psychiatric subjects, decades before the invention of the EEG. But nothing about it resembled science as we know it. Crowhurst wrote that the boy's pulse synchronized with the flicker of a candle set 3 feet away. A visible resonance, he called it. He matches the flame's rhythm, as though aware of its heartbeat. Assistants begged to end the tests. Crowhurst refused. He reduced lighting to near darkness and watched the boy's silhouette through a pane of smoked glass. He wrote that shadows seemed to move before the subject did, reversing cause and effect. One entry reads, "He saw me before I thought to move." From this point his handwriting changes entirely larger and even, as if written under duress. The next pages are smudged with what could be candle soot. The experiment notes stop mid-sentence when the assistants returned the following morning. They found Crowhurst asleep on the floor, the instruments humming faintly. The boy sat upright, eyes open, wires detached. No burns, no marks, no sign of harm. Yet every clock in the ward showed a different time, and none would keep rhythm again. Over the following days, Crowhurst refused rest, sketching diagrams that blended anatomy with circuitry, veins branching into circuits, hearts depicted as magnets. He began referring to the child as the instrument. He believed he had recorded thought itself, a transmission that leapt between mind and matter. Documents confirm that on August 6th, he summoned photographer Samuel Larch, a professional accustomed to forensic work. The goal was simple: visual evidence. The result would become the most disputed image in the asylum's history. Before that session, Crowhurst wrote one final coherent paragraph: "If the mirror learns to reflect before the object moves, the image will command the source. The living may become the shadow." The handwriting that follows degenerates into scrawled phrases, half Latin, half gibberish. One repeated line translates loosely to "We borrowed his face to see what follows." Assistants later testified that the air in the isolation room felt heavy, charged like the moments before a storm. They heard whispering, though the boy did not move his lips. Crowhurst forbade them to speak of it. That night, one attendant recorded hearing two voices inside the locked cell, one child's, one adult saying the same words with perfect delay. "He resigned before sunrise." The doctor's journals end here. The remaining pages are blank except for an ink blot that spreads over the papers. Edge like spilled mercury. It was the last time the experiments were recorded in writing. The next surviving account comes from Samuel Larch's exposure log, written the day he arrived with his camera. What followed lasted only 15 seconds, but those seconds would outlive everyone present. Samuel Larch arrived at St. Wilfrid's on August 8, 1882, carrying a portable camera, tripod, and a box of collodion plates. He was a craftsman, not a mystic. His business was documenting wounds, bodies, and accident scenes for insurance and the coroner's office. Nothing frightened him until he met the boy. Records confirm that the photograph session was approved under the heading "Observation of Somnambulate Subject, Visual Study." Crowhurst's instructions were precise. 15-second exposure under candlelight. Subject seated upright, eyes open. Larch was to use silver nitrate and collodion, standard for the period. Nothing unusual. According to Larch's testimony, the boy never blinked. His face remained still, but the air around him shimmered faintly, as if seen through heat. Crowhurst whispered notes to himself, marking each second aloud. At the count of 10, the candle flame fluttered, though no window was open. At 15, Larch capped the lens and stepped back. When he began to develop the plate, the smell of ether filled the ward. Larch described feeling dizzy, the air thick and humming. Crowhurst leaned over the tray, his hands trembling. As the image surfaced, both men saw it at once. The boy's face appeared twice, one upright, one inverted. The two shared the same eyes. The second face seemed to emerge from beneath the first, mouth closed, gaze inverted but aligned. It was not blur or double exposure. The chemistry did not allow it. The detail was too perfect. Both sets of pupils mirrored each other exactly. The lab assistant screamed and collapsed. Larch dropped a plate. It struck the table, cracked from the center outward. Yet the glass did not shatter. The fracture radiated like frost, stopping short of the edges. Crowhurst seized the plate and placed it under lock. The next day he ordered another exposure. The photographer refused. His written statement calls the first plate an abomination of optics. He left the hospital without payment. The assistant resigned at the same hour. Official records list the photograph under unidentified patient. Anomaly 14. It was filed in 1911 after being rediscovered among St. Wilfrid's salvage inventory. The negative had darkened, but the double image remained. Modern chemical analysis confirms it is genuine. No evidence of retouching, no second exposure, no composite. Some argued it was the result of vibration, a brief tremor during exposure. Yet experts point out that the furniture and background remain perfectly sharp. Only the boy's face shows duplication. Others suggested misalignment of lens elements. But collodion cameras of that design could not produce inverted mirroring within a single frame. Crowhurst wrote a single line beneath the photograph in his ledger. The instrument has recorded itself twice. The words are faint, scratched into the paper rather than written. According to later reports, he began to speak to the image as if it were alive. Nurses recalled him carrying the cracked plate wrapped in cloth, whispering apologies to it. He claimed the boy had split in that moment, that one half remained, and the other learned to watch. By August 10th, the photograph had become forbidden within the ward. Staff refused to enter the darkroom. The few who glimpsed the image described a feeling of vertigo, followed by persistent headaches and dreams of mirrors. One diary found decades later describes seeing the boy's reflection blinking in rhythm with my heartbeat. Rumors spread that the plate glowed faintly in darkness. There is no proof of this, though one inventory note includes the phrase "luminescence observed as continue." The writer's name is illegible. Crowhurst's obsession deepened. He began locking himself in the isolation cell with both the boy and the photograph. Witnesses heard him speaking to someone long after the child had fallen silent. When questioned, he said only, "He listens from the other side." On August 14th, the ward experienced a power surge through its crude electrical system, lights flickering, circuits sparking. The battery powering Crowhurst's galvanic instruments melted down. The fire that followed was contained, but the isolation room filled with smoke. Both subjects, doctor and child, were found unconscious but alive. The plate, kept in a sealed box, survived untouched. After that night, Crowhurst's writing ceased entirely. Assistants documented his erratic behavior, wandering halls, speaking to walls, tracing circles with his fingers. He never entered the isolation room again. The boy remained unresponsive, eyes open, pulse irregular but steady. Larch never returned to the asylum. His studio burned in 1885, destroying most of his negatives. Only one copy of the St. Wilfrid's image was known to remain. It surfaced again in 1911, cracked, warped, yet unmistakable, the same face twice, sharing the same eyes. Photographic historians still debate the mechanism. Some claim an unseen reflection off the glass plate, others a chemical echo caused by contaminated silver salts. Modern analysts who scanned the negative digitally found no trace of tampering. The plate behaves as if it had recorded two exposures separated not by time, but by direction. And still, when viewed under light, the inverted image seems to move first. That photograph, the one that should not exist, became the central artifact of St. Wilfrid's downfall. It was the last thing anyone truly saw before the hospital began to collapse, both physically and in memory. By late August 1882, the air inside St. Wilfrid's had changed. Staff described it as a heaviness, a damp pressure in the lungs. Lamps smoked faster, paper curled from humidity, though no rain had fallen in days. The hospital ledger for that month contains fewer entries than any other period of its operation. Only 3 lines repeat: seizure incidents increasing, containment ongoing. Records confirmed the first fatality on August 21st. The victim is listed only as unnamed male. Presumed collapse. The description: age, weight, dark hair matches the boy, yet the next page, written in a different hand, notes: subject remains under observation. The contradiction has never been explained. Witnesses claimed the body continued to move for 3 days after death. An attendant reported seeing the child's chest rise once, sharply, long after cessation of heartbeat. Crowhurst wrote nothing during this period, but an unsigned memo states, "Doctor insists he is not dead, only inverted." The asylum board ordered the ward sealed. The doctor resisted, then vanished from supervision. His last confirmed sighting was at dawn, pacing the chapel ruins barefoot, muttering to himself. The matron described him as half-shadowed, as if light could not settle on him. Within a week, the hospital began to unravel. Children in nearby wards suffered synchronized convulsions. Medical equipment failed. Patients in unrelated rooms shouted the boy's name, though none had ever met him. The church dispatched a team to perform cleansing rites, but by their arrival, the facility was already abandoned. According to the city register, St. Wilfrid's ceased operations in 1884. The official reason: fire and financial insolvency. But no insurance claim survives, and no photograph of the ruins was ever filed. Of Crowhurst, the record ends abruptly. Some claimed he fled to France, taking the anomalous plate with him. Others suggest he was buried anonymously in the hospital cemetery, his grave unmarked. In 1891, a French medical journal published an unsigned article describing a child who doubled within the lens. The language resembles Crowhurst's. The editor listed the submission as received by post. No return address. The hospital site remained empty until demolition crews arrived before the First World War. During excavation, workers uncovered warped iron rails and a melted bell from the old chapel tower. The bell's inner surface bore a pattern that resembled a face, upside down. The discovery was not reported to authorities. The foreman ordered it buried again. When the National Archive catalogued surviving asylum documents decades later, they found only fragments, burnt admission forms, fragments of ledgers, and a sealed envelope containing the photograph. The envelope was marked "returned to private custody." No signature, no explanation. The building's name disappeared from most local histories. Maps printed after 1900 omitted entirely, as if the institution had never existed. Only parish records retained the address, annotated with a warning, "ground unsanctified." Those who handled the photograph in later years reported an unsettling pattern: clocks slowing, watches stopping, headaches that mirrored Crowhurst's own complaints. One archivist refused to work nights after hearing what she called 2 voices breathing inside the image. No verifiable trace of the boy remains. No birth certificate, no death entry, no grave. And yet, the photograph survives, its emulsion unchanged, its double gaze intact. It endures as the last testimony of St. Wilfrid's, a fragment of a story that history pretends not to remember. By the middle of the 20th century, the photograph had resurfaced again, this time not as evidence, but as myth. Archivists catalogued it under anomalous artifacts, file reference for B19. No patient name, no photographer credit, only the notation, unknown, 1882. The image was reproduced in low contrast and circulated among researchers of psychiatry's early history. That was when the theories began. Neurologists in the 1950s reinterpreted the events of St. Wilfrid's through modern terminology. They dismissed the supernatural entirely. The boy, they argued, suffered from an encephalitic fuga, rare inflammation of the brain producing trance states, language disturbance, and mirror delusions. The apparent contagion among the other children was diagnosed as mass psychogenic illness, the power of suggestion amplified by confinement. They called Crowhurst's observations protoneurology. decades ahead of his time, though tainted by mysticism. A few cited the photo as a simple accident, a double exposure caused by Larch's trembling hand. The chemical fracture, they said, was coincidence, the duplicate pupils a trick of emulsion. But the theory did not settle the unease. By the 1970s, paranormal journals reclaimed the photograph as proof of psychic resonance, a human mind imprinted twice within one moment of exposure. Writers in fringe circles claimed the inverted image represented the boy's astral displacement, the visual record of spirit life. Some even proposed that the photograph itself was the contagion, transmitting its pattern to anyone who looked too long. It was said that several collectors who handled the original plate suffered identical migraines, recurring every August. One archivist reportedly dreamed in Latin for weeks after examining it under microscope. Such stories blurred fact and fable, but they grew persistent enough to draw attention from chemical conservators. In the early 2000s, digital analysts rescanned the surviving plate using high-resolution imaging. Their findings unsettled both camps. There were no brush marks, no evidence of retouching, and no secondary exposure lines. The negative behaved as a single chemical event, yet the mirrored face contained distinct depth cues, a shadow beneath the chin, inverted perfectly. The duplication was three-dimensional, not flat. A 2007 report concluded that the phenomenon cannot be reproduced through known 19th-century techniques. For skeptics, this meant an unknown photographic error. For others, it reopened the question of whether Crewhurst had captured something beyond the mechanical dot around the same time. A new document surfaced, an anonymous microfilm fragment from the 1930s labeled Wolfred Transfer Files. The images were blurry, but one line was legible. Family of Dr. Elias Crowhurst requests suppression of research materials on moral grounds. That page vanished before verification. The National Archives list the file today as lost transferred. Folklorists took the discovery as vindication. To them, the family's silence was not guilt but fear. They proposed that St. Wilfrid stood at a cultural crossroads, where theology and science tore open the same door from opposite sides. The boy became a vessel for their collision, an embodiment of an empire's dread of invisible inheritance, sin or sickness passed through thought. Modern neurologists remain cautious. Some interpret the photograph as a psychological Rorschach. It endures because it mirrors the viewer's own hunger for pattern. What we see there, they argue, is not an anomaly but projects a reflection of our refusal to accept coincidence. And yet the technical record will not close. Every attempt to reproduce the duplication fails. Even digital simulation falters. No software can align the two faces without visible distortion. The original plate remains singular. It rests today in a private collection, location undisclosed. The curator allows no reproductions, only written descriptions. Scholars who have seen it firsthand agree on one detail. Under certain light, the inverted face seems to shift before the upright one. The same illusion Samuel Larch described 140 years ago. Science calls it persistence of vision. Folklore calls it memory refusing burial. Either way, the photograph continues to move slowly, almost imperceptibly, while everything else around it ages. Every mystery ends in reflection. The longer one studies the photograph, the less certain the direction of its gaze becomes. Historians see an artifact of failed psychiatry. The devout see proof that faith still lingers in the dark corners of science. Others, perhaps wiser, admit they do not know what they see at all. What remains certain is the human desire to fill silence with meaning. We name what unsettles us so that we can live beside it. Crowhurst named his discovery The Instrument. The church called it Contagion. Later generations called it myth. Yet each title hides the same unease, that something real once happened in that ward. Something the vocabulary of its age could not contain. Documents confirm that every attempt to close the case ends where speculation begins. The photograph endures not because it proves anything, but because it refuses to die. It occupies the space between evidence and imagination, the exact point where history and belief trade places. Modern eyes view the image through glass and pixels, seeking logic in silver. But logic falters under its steady stare. For some, the duplication reads as optical error. For others, it whispers of continuity, a consciousness lingering just long enough to be caught twice. Look too long, and the boy's eyes appear to align with your own. The longer the gaze, the smaller the distance. Eventually it is unclear who observes whom. The mirrored pupils seem to shift faintly, like ripples on still water. Or perhaps it is only the watcher who moves. We build archives to keep the past in order, to trap chaos in labeled boxes. Yet anomalies like this remind us that archives are mirrors too. They reflect our need for certainty, even when certainty is impossible. The St. Wilfrid's photograph is not proof of the supernatural, nor is it a hoax. It is a reminder that the line between what is recorded and what is imagined has always been fragile. It asks a question that no microscope, prayer, or algorithm can answer. When we stare into an image that should not exist, what part of us is staring back? The boy remains there, unchanged, waiting within that frozen moment. Two sets of pupils watching across a century and a half. His silence invites one final decision, your own. Was this an error of chemistry, a miracle of mind, or something else entirely? Decide quickly. History, like the photograph, never blinks.